Anyhow, we are here, so let us begin. The Law and the Promise, Chapter 12. Mental things are alone real. What is called corporeal, nobody knows of its dwelling place. It is in fallacy, and its existence an impostor. Where is the existence out of mind or thought? Where is it but in the mind of a fool? William Blake. Memory, though faulty, is adequate to the call for sameness. If we remember another as we have known him, we recreate him in that image, and the past will be recognized in the present. Imagining creates reality. If there is room for improvement, we should reconstruct him with new content. Visualize him as we would like him to be, rather than have him bear the burden of our memory of him. Everything possible to be believed is an image of truth. The following story is by one who believes that imagining creates reality, stepping with faith, and acting on this belief changed his attitude toward a stranger and bore witness to his change in reality. More than 20 years ago, when I was a great farm boy, newly arrived in Boston to attend school, a panhandler asked me for money for a meal. Although the money I had was pitifully insufficient for my own needs, I gave him what was in my pocket. A few hours later, the same man, by this time staggering drunk, stopped me again and asked for money. I was so outraged to think the money I could so ill afford had been put to such use. I made myself a solemn pledge that I would never again listen to the plea of a street beggar. Through the years, I kept my pledge, but every time I refused anyone, my conscience needled me. I felt guilty, even to the point of developing a sharp pain in my stomach, but I couldn't bring myself to unbend. The early part of this year, a man stopped me as I was walking my dog and asked for money so he could eat. True to the old pledge, I refused him. His manner was gracious, and as he accepted my refusal. He even admired my dog and spoke of a family in New York State he knew that raised Cocker Spaniels. This time my conscience was really pricking me. As he went on his way, I determined to remake that scene as I wished it had been. So I stopped right there on the street, closed my eyes for only a few moments, and enacted the scene differently. In my imagination, I had the same man approach me. Only this time he opened the conversation by admiring my dog. After we had talked a moment, I had him say, "I don't like to ask you this, but I really need something to eat. I have a job that begins tomorrow morning, but I've been out of work and tonight I'm hungry." I then reached into my imaginary pocket, pulled out an imaginary $5 bill, and gladly gave it to him. This imaginal act immediately dissolved the guilty feeling and the pain. I know from your teaching that an imaginal act is fact, so I knew I could grant anyone what he asked, and by faith in the imaginal act, consent to the reality of his having it. 4 months later, as I again was walking my dog, the same man approached me and opened the conversation by admiring my dog. "Here's a beautiful dog," he said. "Young man, I don't suppose you remember me, but a while back I asked you for some money and you very kindly said no. I say kindly because if you had given it to me, I would still be asking for money. Instead, I got a job that very next morning, and now I'm on my feet and have some self-respect again." I knew his job was a fact when I imagined it that night some 4 months before. But I won't deny there was immense satisfaction in having him appear in the flesh to confirm it. F.B. I have no silver and gold, but I give you what I have. Acts 3:6. None is to be discarded. All must be saved, and our imagination reshaping memory is the process whereby this salvation is brought to pass. To condemn the man for having lost his way is to punish the already punished. Oh, whom should I pity if I pity not the sinner who's gone astray? Not what the man was, but what he may become should be our imaginal activity. Don't you remember sweet Alice, Ben Bolt? Sweet Alice whose hair was so brown? Who wept with delight when you gave her a smile and trembled with fear at your frown? If we imagine no worse of him than he of himself, he would pass as excellent. It's not the man at his best, but the imaginist exercising the spirit of forgiveness that performs the miracle. Imagining with new content transformed both the man who asked and the man who gave. Imagining has not yet had its due in the systems either of moralists or educators. When it does, there will be the opening of the prison to those who are bound. Nothing has existence for us save through the memory we have of it. Therefore, we should remember it not as it was, unless, of course, it was altogether desirable, but as we desire it to be. Inasmuch as imagination or imagining is creative, our memory of another either furthers or hinders him and makes his upward or downward way easier and swifter. There is no coal of character so dead that it will not glow and flame if but slightly turned. The following story shows that imagining can make rings and husbands and move people to China. My husband, child of a broken home and raised by beloved grandparents, was never close to his mother, nor she to him. A woman of 63 and a divorcee for 32 of those years, she was lonely and embittered, and my relationship with her was strained as I attempted to stay in the middle. By her own admission, her great desire was to remarry for companionship, but she believed this to be impossible at her age. My husband would always state to me that he hoped she would remarry, as he fervently put it, perhaps live way out of town. I had the same wish, and as I put it, perhaps move to China. Being wary of my personal motive for this wish, I knew I must change my feeling toward her in my imaginal drama, and at the same time give her what she wanted. I began by seeing her in my imagination as a completely changed personality, a happy, joyous woman, secure and contented in her new relationship. Every time I thought of her, I would see her mentally as a new woman. About 3 weeks later, she came to our house for a visit, bringing a friend she had met many months previously. The man had recently become a widower. He was her age, secure financially, and had grown children and grandchildren. We liked him, and I was excited because it was obvious they liked each other. But my husband still thought it was impossible. I didn't. From that day on, every time her image rose in my mind, I saw her extending her left hand toward me, and I admired the ring on her finger. 1 month later, she and her friend came to visit us, and as I walked forward to greet her, or greet them, she proudly extended her left hand. The ring was on her finger. 2 weeks later, she was married, and we haven't seen her since. She lives in a brand new home, way out of town, and as her new husband dislikes the long drive to our house, she might as well have moved to China. J.B. There is a wide difference between the will to resist an activity and the decision to change it. There is a wide difference between the will to resist an activity and the decision to change it. He who changes an activity acts, whereas he who resists an activity reacts. One creates, the other perpetuates. Nothing is real beyond the imaginative patterns we make of it. Memory, no less than desire, resembles a daydream. Why make it a daymare? Man can forgive only if he treats memory as a daydream and shapes it to his heart's desire. R.K. learned that we may rob others of their abilities by our attitudes toward them. He changed his attitude and thereby changed a fact. I am not a moneylender, nor am I in the investment business as such. But a friend and business acquaintance came to me for a substantial loan in order to expand his plant. Because of personal friendship, I granted the loan with reasonable interest rates and gave my friend the right of renewal at the end of 1 year. When the first year term expired, he was behind in his interest payments and requested a 30-day extension on the note. I granted this request. But at the end of 30 days, he was still unable to meet the note and asked for an additional extension. As I previously stated, I am not in the business of lending money. Within 20 days, I needed full payment of the loan to meet debts of my own. But I consented again to extend the note, although my own credit was now in serious jeopardy. The natural thing to do was to apply legal pressure to collect, and a few years ago I would have done just that. Instead, I remembered your warning not to rob others of their ability, and I realized that I had been robbing my friend of his ability to pay what he owed. For 3 nights, I constructed a scene in my imagination in which I heard my friend tell me that unexpected orders had flooded his desk so rapidly he was now able to pay the loan in full. The fourth day, I received a telephone call from him. He told me that by what he called a miracle, he had received so many orders, and big ones too, he was now able to pay back my loan, including all interest due, and in fact had just mailed a check to me for the entire amount. R.K. There is nothing more fundamental to the secret of imagining than the distinction between imagining and the state imagined. Mental things are alone real. Everything possible to be believed is an image of truth. Chapter 13. All Trivia. General knowledge is remote knowledge. It is in it's in blast. It is in particulars that wisdom consists and happiness too. We must use our imagination to achieve particular ends, even if the ends are all trivia. Because men do not clearly define and imagine particular ends, the results are uncertain, while they might be perfectly certain. To imagine particular ends is to discriminate clearly. How do we distinguish the oak from the beech, the horse from the ox, but by the bounding outline? Definition asserts the reality of the particular thing against the formless generalizations which flood the mind. Life on earth is a kindergarten for image making. The bigness or littleness of the object to be created is not in itself important. The great and golden rule of art, as well as of life, said Blake, is this: that the more distinct, sharp, and wiry the bounding line, the more perfect the work of art, and the less keen and sharp, the greater is the evidence of weak imitation. What is it that builds a house and plants a garden but the definite and the determinate? Leave out this line and you leave out the life itself. The following stories are concerned with the acquiring of seemingly little things, or toys, as I call them, but they are important because of the clear imaginal images that created the toys. The author of the first story is one of whom it is said she has everything. This is true. She has financial, social, and intellectual security. She writes, as you know, through your teachings and through my practice of that teaching, I have completely changed my life and myself. 2 weeks ago, when you spoke of toys, I realized I had never used my imagination for the getting of things, and I decided it would be fun to try it. You told of a young woman who was given a hat by merely wearing that hat in her imagination. The last thing on earth I needed was a hat, but I wanted to test my imagination for this getting of things. So I selected a hat pictured in a fashion magazine. I cut the picture out and stuck it on the mirror of my dressing table. I studied the picture carefully. Then I shut my eyes, and in my imagination, I put that hat on my head and wore it as I walked out of the house. I did this just once. The following week, I met some friends for luncheon, and one of them was wearing the hat. We all admired it. The very next day, I received the parcel by special delivery messenger. The hat was in the parcel. The friend who had worn it the day before had sent the hat to me with a note saying she did not particularly care for the hat and didn't know why she had bought it in the first place. But for some reason, she thought it would look well on me, and would I please accept it? GL. Movement from dreams to things is the power driving humanity. We must live wholly on the level of imagination, and it must be consciously and deliberately undertaken. All my life, I have loved birds. I enjoy watching them, hearing their chatter, feeding them, and I am particularly fond of the small sparrow. For many months, I have fed them crumbs of morning bread, wild bird seed, and anything I believed they would eat. And for all those months, I had been frustrated as I watched the larger birds, particularly the pigeons, command the area, gobbling up most of the good seed and leaving the husks for my sparrows. To use my imagination on this problem seemed facetious to me at first, but the more I thought of it, the more interesting the idea became. So one night I set out seeing the little birds come in for their full share of daily offerings. And I would tell my wife that the pigeons no longer interfered with my sparrows, but took their share like gentlemen and then left the area. I continued this imaginary action for almost 1 month. Then one morning, I noticed that the pigeons had disappeared. The sparrows had breakfast all to themselves for a few days. For those few days, no larger bird entered the area. They did return eventually, but to this day, they have never again infringed on the area occupied by my sparrows. They stay together, eating what I put out for them, leaving a full share of the area to my tiny friends. And do you know, I actually believe the sparrows understand. They no longer seem to be afraid when I walk among them. RK. This lady proves that unless our heart is in the task, unless we imagine ourselves right into the feeling of our wish fulfilled, we are not there. For we are all imagination and must be where and what we are in imagination. In early February, my husband and I had been in our new house 1 month. A home lovely beyond telling, perched on a rugged cliff with the ocean for our front yard. Wind and sky for neighbors, and seagulls for guests. Oh, we were ecstatic. If you have experienced the joy and woe of building your own home, you know how completely filled with happiness you are and how completely empty your purse is. 100 lovely things clamored to be bought for that house, but the one thing we wanted most of all was the most useless: a picture. Not just any picture, but a wild, wonderful scene of the sea dominated by a great white clipper ship. This picture had been in our thoughts all the months of building, and we left one living room wall free of paneling to hold it. My husband mounted decorative red and green ship lanterns on the wall to frame our picture, but the picture itself would have to wait. Draperies, carpeting, all the particular items must come first. Perhaps so, but that didn't stop either of us from seeing that picture in our imagination on that wall. One day while shopping, I strolled into a small art gallery. And as I walked through the door, I stopped so suddenly, a gentleman walking behind me crashed into an easel. I apologized and pointed to a painting hanging at head height across the room. That's what did it. I'd never seen anything so wonderful. He introduced himself as the owner of the gallery and said, "Yes, an original, but the greatest English painter of clipper ships the world has known." He went on to tell me about the artist, but I wasn't listening. I could not take my eyes from that wonderful ship. And suddenly I experienced a very strange thing. It was only a moment in time, but the art gallery faded, and I saw that picture on my wall. I'm afraid the owner thought me a little giddy, and I was. But I finally managed to return my attention to his voice when he mentioned an astronomical price. I smiled and said, "Perhaps someday." He continued to tell me about the painter, and also about an American artist who was the only living lithographer capable of copying the great English master. He said, "If you're very lucky, you may pick up one of his prints. I've seen his work. It's perfect down to the last detail. Many people prefer prints to paintings." Prints or paintings, I knew nothing about the value of either, and anyway, all I wanted was that scene. When my husband returned home that evening, I talked of nothing but that painting and pleaded with him to visit the gallery and see it. Maybe we could find a print of it somewhere. The man said, "Well, yes," he interrupted, "but we can't afford any picture now." Our conversation ended there. But that night after dinner, I stood in our living room and saw that picture on our wall. The next day, my husband had an appointment with a client, which he did not want to keep. But the appointment was kept, and my husband did not return home until after dark. When he walked through the front door, I was busy in another part of the house and called a greeting to him. A few minutes later, I heard hammering and walked into the living room to see what he was doing. On our wall hung my picture. In my first moment of intense joy, I remembered the man in the art gallery saying, "Well, if you're lucky, if you're very lucky, you may pick up one of his prints." Lucky? Well, here's my husband's part of this story. Making the call already mentioned, he entered one of the poorest, meanest little houses he had ever been in. The client introduced himself and led my husband into a tiny, dark dining area where the two of them sat down at a bare table. As my husband put his briefcase on the tabletop, he looked up and saw the picture on a wall. He confessed to me he had conducted a very sloppy interview because he couldn't take his eyes from that picture. The client signed the contract and gave me a check as down payment, which, as my husband believed at the time, was $10 short. Mentioning this fact to the client, he said the check given was every cent he could afford, but added, "I've noticed your interest in that picture. It was here when I took this place. I don't know to whom it belonged, but I don't want it. If you'll put the $10 in for me, I'll give you the picture." When my husband returned to his company's main office, he learned he had been in error about the amount. He was not charged $10. "Our picture is on our wall, and it cost us nothing." A.A. Of R.L., who writes the following letter, it must be said, "In faith, lady, you have a merry heart." One day during a bus strike, I needed to go into the downtown area and had to walk 10 blocks from my home to the nearest bus in operation. Before starting home, I recalled there was no food market on this new route, and I wouldn't be able to shop for dinner. I had enough to manage a potluck meal, but I would need bread. After shopping all day, the 10 blocks back to the bus line was all I could manage, and to go still further to shop for bread was out of the question. I stood very still for a moment and allowed a vision of bread to dance in my head. Then I started for home. When I boarded the bus, I was so tired I grabbed the first available seat and almost sat on a paper bag. Now, on a crowded bus, Tired passengers rarely looked directly at one another. So, being naturally curious, I peeked into the bag. Of course, it was a loaf of bread. Not just any bread, but the very same brand of bread I always buy. RL. Trifles, all trifles. But they produced their trivia without price. Imagining accomplished these things without the means generally reputed necessary to do so. Man rates wealth in a way that bears no relation to real values. Come buy wine and milk without money and without price. Isaiah 55:1. Chapter 14. The creative moment. The natural man does not receive the gifts of the Spirit of God, for they are folly to him, and he is not able to understand them because they are spiritually discerned. 1 Corinthians 2:14. There is a moment in each day that Satan cannot find, nor can his watch fiends find it. But the industrious find this moment, and it multiply, and when it once is found, it renovates every moment of the day if rightly placed. William Blake. Whenever we imagine things as they ought to be, rather than as they seem to be, is the moment. For in that moment, the spiritual man's work is done, and all the great events of time start forth to mold a world in harmony with that moment's altered pattern. Satan, Blake writes, is a reactor. He never acts, he only reacts. And if our attitude to the happenings of the day is reactionary, are we not playing Satan's part? Man is only reacting in his natural or Satan state. He never acts or creates. He only reacts or recreates. One real creative moment, one real feeling of the wish fulfilled is worth more than the whole natural life of reaction. In such a moment, God's work is done. Once more may we say with Blake, God only acts and is in existing beings or men. There is an imaginal past and an imaginal future. If by reacting the past is recreated into the present, so by acting out our dreams of fancy can the future be brought into the present. I feel now the future in the instant. The spiritual man acts. For him, anything that he wants to do, he can do and do at once in his imagination. And his motto is always, the moment is now. Behold, now is the acceptable time. Behold, now is the day of salvation. 2 Corinthians 6:2. Nothing stands between man and the fulfillment of his dream but facts. And facts are the creations of imagining. If man changes his imagining, he will change the facts. This story tells of a young woman who found the moment and by acting out her dream of fancy, brought the future into the instant, not realizing what she had done until the final scene. The incident related below must appear to be coincidence to those never exposed to your teaching. But I know I observed an imaginative act take solid form in perhaps 4 minutes. I believe you will be interested in reading this account, written down exactly as it happened, a few minutes after the actual occurrence yesterday morning. I was driving my car east on Sunset Boulevard in the center lane of traffic, braking slowly to stop for a red signal at a three-way intersection when my attention was caught by the sight of an elderly lady dressed all in gray running across the street in front of my car. Her arm was raised, signaling to the driver of a bus which was beginning to pull away from the curb. She was obviously attempting to cross in front of the bus to delay it. The driver slowed his vehicle, and I thought would allow her to enter. Instead, as she jumped onto the curb, the bus pulled away, leaving her standing just in the act of lowering her arm. She turned and walked swiftly toward a nearby phone booth. As my signal changed to green and I put my car in motion, I wished I had been behind the bus and had been able to offer her a ride. Her extreme agitation was obvious even from the distance I was away from her. My wish instantly fulfilled itself in a mental drama. And as I drove away, the fancy played itself out in the following scene. I opened the car door, and a lady dressed in gray stepped in, smilingly, relieved and thanking me profusely. She was out of breath from running and said, "I only have a few blocks to go. I'm meeting friends, and I was so afraid they would leave without me when I missed my bus." I left my imaginary lady out a few blocks further on, and she was delighted to observe her friends still waiting for her. She thanked me again and walked away. The entire mental scene was spanned in the time it takes to drive 1 block at a normal rate of speed, Marjorie. The fancy satisfied my feelings regarding the real incident, and I immediately forgot it. 4 blocks further, I was still in the center lane and again had to stop for a red signal. My attention at this time was turned inward on something I have now forgotten. Then suddenly someone tapped on the closed window of my car, and I looked up to see a lovely appearing elderly lady with gray hair, dressed all in gray. Smiling, she asked if she might ride a few blocks with me as she had missed her bus. She was out of breath, as though from running. And I was so stunned by her sudden appearance in the middle of a busy street at my window that for a moment I could only react physically, and without answering, leaned over and opened my car door. She got in and said, "It's so annoying to rush so and then miss a bus. I wouldn't have imposed on you like this, but I'm supposed to meet some friends a few blocks down the street. And if I had to walk now, I would miss them." 6 blocks further on, she exclaimed, "Oh, good, they're still waiting for me." I let her out, and she thanked me again and walked away. I'm afraid I drove to my own destination by automatic reflex, for I had fully recognized that I had just observed a waking dream take form in physical action. I recognized what was happening while it was happening. As soon as I could, I wrote down each part of the incident and found a startling consistency between the waking dream and the subsequent reality. Both women were elderly, gracious in manner, dressed all in gray, and out of breath from hurrying to catch a bus and missing it. Both wished to meet friends who for some reason could not wait for them much longer, and both left my car within the space of a few blocks, after successfully completing their contact with their friends. I am amazed, confounded, and elated. If there is no such thing as coincidence or accident, then I witnessed imagination become reality almost instantaneously. J.R.B. There is a moment in each day that Satan cannot find, nor can his watch fiends find it. But the industrious find this moment, and it multiply, and when it once is found, it renovates every moment of the day if rightly placed. From the time I read your search, I have longed to experience a vision. Since you have told us of the promise, this desire has been intensified. I want to tell you of my vision, which was a glorious answer to my prayer. But I am sure I would not have had this experience were it not for something that occurred 2 weeks ago. It was necessary for me to park my car some distance from the university building where I was scheduled to conduct my class. As I left my car, I was conscious of the stillness about me. The street was completely deserted. No one was in sight. Suddenly, I heard a most frightful cursing voice. I looked toward the sound and saw a man brandishing a cane, yelling between vile words, "I'll kill you! I'll kill you!" I continued on as he approached me, for at that moment I thought, now I can test what I have professed to believe. If I do believe we are one, the Father, this derelict, and I, no harm can come to me. And at that moment I had no fear. Instead of seeing a man coming toward me, I felt a light. He stopped yelling, dropped his cane, and walked quietly as we passed with less than a foot between us. Having tested my faith at that moment, everything about me had seemed more alive than before. Flowers brighter and trees greener. I have had a sense of peace and the oneness of life I had not known before. Last Friday, I drove to our country home. Nothing was unusual about the day or evening. I worked on a manuscript and, not being tired, did not try to fall off to sleep until around 2 the following morning. Then I turned off the light and drifted into that floating sensation. Not asleep, but drowsy, as I call it, half awake and half asleep. Often while in this state, lovely unknown faces float before me, but this morning the experience was different. A perfect face of a child came before me in profile. Then it turned and smiled at me. It was glowing with light and seemed to fill my own head with light. I was aglow and excited and thought this must be the Christos, but something within me without sound said, "No, this is you. I feel I will never be the same again, and someday I may experience the promise." GB. Our dreams will all be realized from the time that we know that imagining creates reality and act. But imagination seeks from us something much deeper and more fundamental than creating things. Nothing less, indeed, than the recognition of its own oneness with God. That what it does is, in reality, God Himself doing it in and through man, who is all imagination. Chapter 15. The Promise. 4 mystical experiences. In all I have related thus far, with the exception of GB's vision of the child, imagination was consciously exercised. Men and women created stage plays in their imagination, plays implying the fulfillment of their desires. Then, by imagining themselves participating in these dramas, they created that which their imaginal acts implied. This is the wise use of God's law. But no man is justified before God by the law. Galatians 3:11. Many people are interested in imaginism as a way of life, but are not at all interested in its framework of faith, a faith leading to the fulfillment of God's promise. I will raise up your son after you, who shall come forth from your body. I will be his father, and he shall be my son. 2 Samuel 7:12-14. The promise that God will bring forth from our body a son who will be born not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God, does not concern them. They want to know God's law, not His promise. However, this miraculous birth has been stated clearly as a must for all mankind from the earliest days of the Christian fellowship. You must be born from above. John 3:7. My purpose here is to state it again, and to state it in such language and with such reference to my own personal mystical experiences that the reader will see that this birth from above is far more than a part of a dispensable superstructure, that it is the sole purpose for God's creation. Specifically, my purpose in recording these 4 mystical experiences is to show what Jesus Christ, the faithful witness, the firstborn from the dead, Revelations 1:5, was trying to say about this birth from above. How can men preach unless they are sent? Romans 10:15. Many years ago, I was taken in spirit into a divine society, a society of men in whom God is awake. Though it may seem strange, the gods do truly meet. As I entered this society, the first to greet me was the embodiment of infinite might. He was a power unknown to mortals. I was then taken to meet infinite love. He asked me, "What is the greatest thing in the world?" I answered him in the words of Paul: "Faith, hope, and love, these three, but the greatest of these is love." At that moment, he embraced me, and our bodies fused and became one body. I was knit to him and loved him as my own soul. The words "love of God," so often a mere phrase, were now a reality with a tremendous meaning. Nothing ever imagined by man could be compared with this love which man feels through his union with love. The most intimate relationship on earth is like living in separate cells compared with this union. While I was in this state of supreme delight, a voice from outer space shouted, "Down with the blue bloods!" At this blast, I found myself standing before the one who had first greeted me. He embodied infinite might. He looked into my eyes, and without the use of words or mouth, I heard what he told me. Time to act. I was suddenly whisked out of that divine society and returned to earth. I was tormented by my limitations of understanding, but I knew that on that day the divine society had chosen me as a companion and sent me to preach Christ, God's promise to man. My mystical experiences have brought me to accept literally the saying that all the world's a stage, and to believe that God plays all the parts. The purpose of the play? To transform man, the created, into God, the creator. God loved man, his created, and became man in faith that this act of self commission would transform man, the created, into God, the creator. The play begins with the crucifixion of God on man as man and ends with the resurrection of man as God. God becomes as we are, that we may be as he is. God becomes man, that man may become first a living being, and secondly, a life giving spirit. I have been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. And the life I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me. Galatians 2:20. God took upon himself the form of man and became obedient unto death, even death on the cross of man, and is crucified on Golgotha, the skull of man. God himself enters death's door, the human skull, and lies down in the grave of man to make man a living being. God's mercy turned death into sleep. Then began the prodigious and unthinkable metamorphosis of man, the transformation of man into God. No man, unaided by the crucifixion of God, could cross the threshold that admits the conscious life. But now we have union with God in his crucified self. He lives in us as our wonderful human imagination. Man is all imagination, and God is man, and exists in us, and we in him. The eternal body of man is the imagination, that is, God himself. When he rises in us, we will be like him, and he will be like us. Then all impossibilities will dissolve in us at that touch of exaltation which his rising in us will impart to our nature. Here's the secret of the world. God died to give man life and to set man free. For however clearly God is aware of his creation, it does not follow that man, imaginatively created, is aware of God. To work this miracle, God had to die, then rise again as man. And none has ever expressed it so clearly as William Blake. Blake says, or rather has Jesus say, "Unless I die, thou canst not live. But if I die, I shall rise again, and thou with me. Wouldst thou love one who never died for thee, or ever die for one who had not died for thee? And if God dieth not for man, and giveth not himself eternally for man, man could not exist. So God dies. That is to say, God has freely given himself for man. Deliberately, he has become man and has forgotten that he is God in the hope that man, thus created, will eventually rise as God. God has so completely offered his own self for man that he cries out on the cross of man, my God, why hast thou forsaken me?" He has completely forgotten that he is God. But after God rises in one man, that man will say to his brothers, "Why stand we here trembling around, calling on God for help and not ourselves, in whom God dwells?" This first man that has been raised from the dead is known as Jesus Christ, the first fruits of those who have fallen asleep, the firstborn of the dead. For man God died. Now by a man has come also the resurrection of the dead. Jesus Christ resurrects his dead father by becoming his father. In Adam, the universal man, God sleeps. In Jesus Christ, the individualized God, God wakes. In waking, man, the created, has become God, the creator, and can truly say, "Before the world was, I am." Just as God, in his love for man, so completely identified himself with man that he forgot that he was God, so man, in his love for God, must so completely identify himself with God that he lives the life of God, that is, imaginatively. God's play, which transforms man into God, is revealed to us in the Bible. It is completely consistent in imagery and symbolism. The New Testament is hid in the Old Testament, and the Old is manifested in the New. The Bible is a vision of God's law and his promise. It was never intended to teach history, but rather to lead man in faith through the furnaces of affliction to the fulfillment of God's promise, to rouse man from this profound sleep and awaken him as God. Its characters live not in the past, but in an imaginative eternity. They are personifications of the eternal spiritual states of the soul. They mark man's journey through eternal death and his awakening to eternal life. The Old Testament tells us of God's promise. The New Testament tells us not how this promise was fulfilled, but how it is fulfilled. The central theme of the Bible is the direct individual mystical experience of the birth of the child, that child of whom the prophet spoke. "To us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government will be upon his shoulder, and his name will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Of the increase of his government and of peace there will be no end." Isaiah 9, 6, and 7. When the child is revealed to us, we see it, we experience it, and the response to this revelation can be stated in the words of Job. "I have heard of thee by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees thee." The story of the incarnation is not fabled, allegory, or some carefully contrived fiction to enslave the minds of men, but mystical fact. It is a personal mystical experience of the birth of oneself out of one's own skull, symbolized in the birth of a child wrapped in swaddling clothes and lying on the floor. There is a distinction between hearing of this birth of a child from one's own skull, a birth which no scientist or historian could ever possibly explain, and actually experiencing the birth, holding in your own hands and seeing with your own eyes this miraculous child, a child born from above out of your own skull, a birth contrary to all the laws of nature. The question, as it is posed in the Old Testament, "Ask now and see, can a male bear a child? Why then do I see every man with his hands delivering himself like a woman in labor? Why has every face turned pale?" Jeremiah 30, verse 6. The Hebrew word sharatz, mistranslated loins, means to draw out, to deliver, to withdraw self. The drawing of oneself out of one's own skull, was exactly what the prophet foresaw as the necessary birth from above. A birth giving man entrance into the kingdom of God and reflective perception on the highest levels of being. Throughout the ages, deep calls to deep. Rouse thyself. Why sleepest thou, O Lord? Awake! The event, as it is recorded in the Gospels, actually takes place in man. But on that day or that hour when the time will come for the individual to be delivered, no one knows but the Father. Do not marvel that I said to you, you must be born from above. The wind blows where it wills, and you will hear the sound of it, but you do not know whence it comes or whither it goes. So it is with everyone who is born of the Spirit. John 3, 7 and 8. This revelation in the Gospel of John is true. Here is my experience of this birth from above. Like Paul, I did not receive it from man, nor was I taught it. It came through the actual mystical experience of being born from above. None can speak truly of this mystical birth from above, but one who has experienced it. I had no idea that this birth from above was literally true. Who before the experience could believe that the child, the wonderful counselor, the mighty God, the everlasting Father, the Prince of Peace, was interwoven in his own skull? Who before the experience would understand that this marker is his husband, that this maker is his husband, and the Lord of hosts is his name? Who would believe that the Creator went in unto his own creation, man, and knew it to be himself, and that this entrance into the skull of man, this union of God and man, resulted in the birth of a son out of the skull of man, which birth gave to that man eternal life and union with his Creator forever? If I now tell what I experienced that night, I do so not to impose my ideas on others, but that I may give hope to those who, like Nicodemus, wonder how can a man be born when he is old? How can he enter a second time into his mother's womb and be born? How can this be? This is how it happened to me. Therefore, I will now write the vision and make it plain upon tablets, so he may run who reads it. For still the vision awaits its time. It hastens to the end. It will not lie. If it seems slow, wait for it. It will surely come. It will not delay. Behold, he whose soul is not upright in him shall fail, but the righteous shall live by his faith. Habakkuk 2, verse 2 and 4. In the early hours of the morning on July 20, 1959, in the city of San Francisco, a heavenly dream in which the arts flourished was suddenly interrupted by the most intense vibration centered at the base of my skull. Then a drama as real as those I experience when I am fully awake began to unfold. I awoke from a dream to find myself completely entombed within my skull. I tried to force my way out through its base. Something gave way, and I felt myself move head downward through the base of my skull. I squeezed myself out inch by inch. When I was almost out, I held what I took to be the foot of the bed and pulled the remaining portion of me out of my skull. There on the floor, I lay for a few seconds. Then I rose and looked at my body on the bed. It was pale of face, lying on its back and tossing from side to side like one in recovery from a great ordeal. As I contemplated it, hoping that it would not fall off the bed, I became aware that the vibration which started the whole drama was not only in my head, but now was also coming from the corner of the room. As I looked over to that corner, I wondered if that vibration could be caused by a very high wind, a wind strong enough to vibrate the window. I did not realize that the vibration which I still felt within my head was related to that which seemed to be coming from the corner of the room. Looking back to the bed, I discovered that my body was gone, but in its place sat my 3 older brothers, My oldest brother sat where the head was. My second and third brothers sat where the feet were. None seemed to be aware of me, although I was aware of them and could discern their thoughts. I suddenly became aware of the reality of my own invisibility. I noticed that they too were disturbed by the vibration coming from the corner of the room. My third brother was the most disturbed, and went over to investigate the cause of the disturbance. His attention was attracted by something on the floor, and looking down, he announced, "It's Neville's baby." My other two brothers, in most incredulous voices, asked, "How can Neville have a baby?" My brother lifted the infant wrapped in swaddling clothes and laid him on the bed. I then, with my invisible hands, lifted the babe and asked him, "How is my sweetheart?" He looked into my eyes and smiled, and I awoke in this world to ponder this greatest of my many mystical experiences. Tennyson has a description of death as a warrior, a skeleton high on a night black horse, issuing forth at midnight. But when the Garrus sword cut through the skull, there was in it the bright face of a blooming boy, fresh as a flower newborn. Idylls of the King. Two other visions I will tell because they bear out the truth of my assertion that the Bible is mystical fact, that everything written about the promised child in the law of Moses and the prophets and the Psalms must be mystically experienced in the imagination of the individual. The child's birth is a sign and a portent, signaling the resurrection of David, the Lord's anointed, of whom he said, "You are my son. Today I have begotten you." Psalm 2, verse 7. 5 months after the birth of the child, on the morning of December 6th, 1959, in the city of Los Angeles, a vibration similar to the one which preceded his birth started in my head. This time, its intensity was centered at the top of my head. Then came a sudden explosion, and I found myself in a modestly furnished room. There, leaning against the side of an open door, was my son David of biblical fame. He was a lad in his early teens. What struck me forcibly about him was the unusual beauty of his face and figure. He was, as he is described in the first book of Samuel, ruddy, with beautiful eyes, and very handsome. Not for one moment did I feel myself to be anyone other than who I am now. Yet I knew that this lad David was my son, and he knew that I was his father, for the wisdom from above is without uncertainty. As I sat there contemplating the beauty of my son, the vision faded, and I awoke. I and the children whom the Lord has given me are signs and portents in Israel from the Lord of hosts, who dwell on Mount Zion. Isaiah 8:18. God gave me David as my very own son. I will raise up your son after you, who shall come forth from your body. I will be his father, and he shall be my son. 2 Samuel 7:12 through 14. God is known in no other way than through the Son. Sugar Visions. No one knows who the Son is except the Father, or who the Father is except the Son, and anyone to whom the Son chooses to reveal him. Luke 10:22. The experience of being David's father is the end of man's pilgrimage on earth. The purpose of life is to find the father of David, the Lord's anointed, the Christ. Abner, whose son is this youth? And Abner said, "As your soul lives, O king, I cannot tell." And the king said, "Inquire whose son this stripling is." And as David returned from the slaughter of the Philistine, Abner took him and brought him before Saul with the head of the Philistine in his hand. And Saul said to him, "Whose son are you, young man?" And David answered, "I am the son of your servant Jesse, the Bethlehemite." 1 Samuel 17:55 through 58. Jesse is any form of the verb to be. In other words, I am the son of who I am. I am self-begotten. I am the son of God the Father. I and my Father are one. I am the image of the invisible God. He who has seen me has seen the Father. Whose son? Is not about David, but about David's father, whom the king had promised, 1 Samuel 17:25, to make free in Israel. Note, in all these passages, 1 Samuel 17:55, 56, and 58, the king's inquiry is not about David, but about David's father. I have found David my servant. He shall cry to me, Thou art my Father, my God, and the rock of my salvation, and I will make him the firstborn, the highest of the kings of the earth. Psalms 89. The individual who is born from above will find David and know him to be his very own son. Then he will ask the Pharisees, who are always with us, What do you think of the Christ? Whose son is he? And when they say to him, the son of David, he will say to them, How is it then that David, in the Spirit, calls him Lord? If David thus calls him Lord, how is he his son? Matthew 22:41 through 45. Man's misconception of the role of the son, which is only a sign and a portent, has made the son an idol. Little children, keep yourselves from idols. 1 John 5:21. God awakes, and that man in whom he awakes becomes his own father's father. He who was David's son, Jesus Christ, the son of David, Matthew 1:1, has become David's father. No longer will I cry to our father, David, thy child, Acts 4:25. I have found David. He has cried to me, Thou art my father, Psalm 89. Now I know myself to be one of the Elohim, the God who became man, that man may become God. Great indeed, we confess, is the mystery of our religion. 1 Timothy 3:16. If the Bible were history, it would not be a mystery. Wait for the promise of the Father. Acts 1:4. That is, for David, God's son, who will reveal you as the Father. This promise, says Jesus, you heard from me, Luke 24:49, and to its fulfillment at that moment in time, when it pleases God to give you his son as your offspring, which is Christ. Galatians 3:16. Tiffany. A figure of speech is used for the purpose of calling attention to, emphasizing, and intensifying the reality of the literal sense. The truth is literal. The words used are figurative. The curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom, and the earth shook and the rocks were split. Matthew 27:51. On the morning of April 8th, 1960, 4 months after it was revealed to me that I am David's father, a bolt of lightning out of my skull split me in two from the top of my skull to the base of my spine. I was cleft as though I were a tree that had been struck by lightning. Then I felt and saw myself as a golden liquid light moving up my spine in a serpentine motion. As I entered my skull, it vibrated like an earthquake. Every word of God proves true. He is a shield to those who take refuge in him. Do not add to his words, lest he rebuke you, and you be found a liar. And as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, so must the Son of Man be lifted up. John 3:14. These mystical experiences will help to rescue the Bible from the externals of history, persons, and events, and to restore it to its real significance in the life of man. Scripture must be fulfilled in us. God's promise will be fulfilled. You will have these experiences, and you shall be my witness in Jerusalem and in all Judea and Samaria, and to the end of the earth. Acts 1:8. The widening circle, Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, the end of the earth, is God's plan. The promise is still maturing to its time, its appointed time. But how long, vast and severe the trials ere you find David your son, who will reveal you as God, the Father, We're long to tell, but it hastens to the end. It will not fail. So wait, for there will be no postponement. Is anything too wonderful for the Lord? At the appointed time, I will return to you in the spring, and Sarah shall have a son. Genesis 18:14. This concludes the reading of The Law and the Promise by Neville Goddard. I trust tonight that you have been emboldened. I trust that you have been emboldened to test your very selves. We are all imagination. What we experience physically, we have already done it imaginally. That is why it is there. So practice living from your imagination. Practice. What have you to gain by doing it? From the sounds of it, much is to be gained. So tonight, my beautiful friends, I do love you. Rest well in the knowing that imagination creates reality. And join us again on Monday, 10:45 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, for seed time and harvest. You see, the whole point of reading these stories to you is to stir up the embers within yourself so that you will be bold to say, I am, and begin to live as I am, calling into the world that which you shape it to be from out of your imagination. Much love to you all, my beautiful friends. Truly, it is a good night. Tiffany, Sugar Visions, Marjorie.
Thank you, thank you, thank you.
You're welcome, Marquise. And Stepping with Faith here on YouTube. I see you all. Rest well, and I'll see you Monday.